Hello, everyone out there in the multiverse. I am Dan.
And I'm Drea, and we own Multiverse Comics and Games in Culpeper, Virginia. And so today we're going to be talking about Canon. Now, this is with one N in the middle, not two. So we're talking about canonization. So, what is canon? What does it mean for something to be canon?
Canon is basically what is the acceptable reality of fictional environments.
Okay, so this is,
basically.
I guess one way to think about this might be the Batman Bible that they had for Batman in the animated series, meaning that they had certain rules that every writer had to follow, and that was considered the canon of the Batman universe for Batman in the animated series. Okay, so that's a good, I guess, starting point.
Yeah.
So
To keep in mind, though, that is its own canon.
that's true.
Because it's not canon to the comics, honestly, because it's its own thing. So that's the weird thing about canon, where everything has its own canon. So you gotta.
Well, and there's also, if you think about it, there's elements of the canon that don't make it to the screen. It's like, you have this idea, for instance, Poison Ivy's origin. It's pretty dark, and not something that they're going to, and when I'm talking about Poison Ivy's origin, I mean the actual origin that the Batman the Animated Series Poison Ivy has. It never comes up on the screen because it is so dark, and yet it's something that is kind of in the back of everyone's mind whenever they're writing an episode with Ivy in it.
Yeah.
So, and so many times you will hear fans start arguments with each other because something is or is not canon. And so, as fans, as comic geeks, as people who dedicate a good chunk of our lives to reading and studying this literature, how much should we be sticklers for canon?
To be truthful, you shouldn't really be too stickler for canon. One good example of that is the MCU.
Okay.
Right? It's very true to the comics, but it is not true to canon, which may seem like an odd statement.
That's a very odd statement. Please explain.
Okay. Before Robert Downey Jr. became Iron Man, Iron Man in the comics wasn't necessarily like Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal.
Okay.
But it's like the spirit of what he was supposed to be. Like, he was supposed to be this playboy, rich celebrity, basically.
Okay.
A bit of a jerk, but on page, it never really came across until Robert Downey Jr. portrayed him,
Okay. Does that mean that elements of him were able to come to the page, or that we just saw those elements in him because we'd seen him in the movies?
Well, after his portrayal in the movies, the comics came to emulate him a bit.
Okay.
But his portrayal is the way I believe Stan Lee would have portrayed Iron Man, which he never really got across.
Okay.
Probably because of the time period in which Iron Man is invented, because,
No.
Characters
didn't need depth, they had lasers.
I mean, Stan Lee gave depth, but
yes, he did.
He's the founder of that.
Yes.
To be able to give depth.
Stanley broke all the rules in order to make them what they are now. Yeah. Yes, I agree with that.
Another example, again from the MCU, is Thor.
Okay.
In the comics, same thing. He's supposed to be arrogant, loses the worthiness and then gets it back and all that stuff. But in the comics, I have never seen Thor really be overly arrogant, other than the way any normal hero is,
Right.
where they think they're right because they need to do the right thing, and then they do the right thing.
They have to be right because they're already punching the guy in the face.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't really see him as arrogant, but the movie made him arrogant, and it made him arrogant in a likable way, too.
Yeah, it was really well done.
The way Thor should be, and which he had really never been portrayed before the movie.
Now, so again, have the comics been able to portray this now that has been established? Or, because it almost seems as if at this point, you're talking less about canon and more about format. Like, the character elements that need to be brought about can't be done so well in comic form, but they can be done in movie form. Is that what you're saying?
No, not necessarily, because they can be, because after that portrayal, I have seen it. You know, it's
Okay.
just it's one of those things that probably again because the time period is created in that, you know, he wasn't really shown as arrogant other than normal heroic arrogance that heroes tend to be.
And maybe it's the idea of, multiple writers writing for one character and never having, for lack of a better term, a marquette. You know what I mean by that?
What do you mean by that?
So a marquette, such as Pinocchio.
Yeah.
Disney uses marquettes, and every drawer, yes, that is the word, the drawer. Every artist that draws that particular character uses that marquette. So Disney would have the marquette. So, and it started with Pinocchio because they actually used a marionette. So it's the first time that it came about. And bear with me while I explain this. So you had the marquette, and it was a figure, and everyone would look at the figure and draw off of that figure. That way the drawings would be consistent, even if it was different artists doing the drawings. This is, of course, before computer animation, where everything was digitized anyway. So did the actors, Robert Downey Jr., Chris Hemsworth, etc., act as a marquette for anyone writing for these characters? That everybody had the same 3D figure to look at, and when I say three-dimensional, I mean not only physical looks but also characteristics. And so, did that help them hone in better and write the character better? This is speculation on our part, of course, but is that kind of what you're getting at?
I would say yes, because ultimately, when something is done in other media outside of the comics, it tends to get adapted into the comics a lot of times. Yeah. And in the case of something popular like the MCU, of course that's going to happen.
Right.
You know. So, yes. Yes.
Well, and of course, when you talk about canon, another thing I'm thinking about, of course, is I'm always going to go back to Batman, but Harley Quinn. She was not canon. She was created for the Batman the Animated Series. And of course, there's other characters that would fit into this category of non-canon becoming canon. Yes. But she's my favorite. But you have this idea of going out of canon and yet becoming one of the most iconic canonized characters in the story.
Okay. Back up a little bit.
Sure.
Animated series. Forget about Harley Quinn.
How dare you?
But since we're speaking of canon, let's not just speak about characters and their personality, but the actual story, because the canon is very much the story.
That's fair. So when you're talking canon, you want to focus more on the story than the character, or are we just focusing on the story for this?
I'm focused. Well, we can focus on both, but
fair
now
enough.
I want to talk about specifically a story.
Okay.
Mr. Freeze.
Right. Yes.
Before Batman the Animated Series, he did not have that tragic origin of his wife dying and him freezing her and everything like that.
And for me, that is Mr. Freeze.
But most people, when they think of Mr. Freeze, they think of that origin, and they don't know that it's only been around since the 90s. You know, since the animated series, they assume that has always been his origin. And, I mean, me being a comic reader, for the longest time, I thought that too.
Yeah.
Even though I read stuff with Mr. Freeze before the animated series was even out.
Yeah, and I mean, that makes sense because if a character has a backstory like that, then you're more able to connect with him. In fact, this is kind of reminiscent of one of our earliest videos when we were talking about Green Lantern and how Green Lantern didn't really have much of a story until it was kind of retconned to have that bigger story, and then all of a sudden you're connecting with that character more. And so that's what happened with Mr. Freeze. So in this case, canonizing a story, and I guess that's another term we need to think about, is the difference between canon and retcon. Now, retcon, of course, means retroactive continuity, and continuity is not necessarily the same thing as canon, but
Well, it essentially is, actually. It's pretty similar.
So fair enough. So
it's the continuity of the canon.
You have canon, you have retcon, and sometimes things need to be retconned in order to make them better, such as Mr. Freeze getting the backstory of Nora, and then of course the whole world getting Harley Quinn because yay.
Yeah.
Sorry. So when is it important? At what point is it important? And for whom is it important to stick to canon. And let me explain to you what I'm saying here. So we've definitely had some movies, definitely comics, even maybe even animated series that have thwarted canon, stepped away from it completely, and not necessarily on purpose, but just ignored it completely, and they have been disasters. So when is canon? When should canon be important, and to whom should it be important?
Canon should be. It shouldn't necessarily be detrimental to the story,
Okay.
right? Because going back to Mr. Freeze, if they wanted to stick to canon, the story would have suffered because they created such a good story for him, and that completely deviated from canon. Now, sometimes there are points where a writer will just want to do stuff differently just to do stuff differently. One thing I can think of is Marvel's Ultimate line, which started out awesome, and it was awesome. I mean, even later on, for a while, it was still awesome. But there were certain stories that they made something different just to be different, and not really because it's a better story, but just to change things.
Right.
And I feel like that's not a good thing to do.
Right.
You know, if the story is there, yes, change it. Otherwise, you can stick to the classic canon, unless you're making a better story.
It's kind of like Super Mario Brothers 2. You know, Super Mario Brothers 2. The only the reason it is so vastly different from the other games is because it was not created as a Mario game, but it wasn't working. It was an interesting format. It was an interesting game, but it did not work under the format. And I don't even remember or know maybe the characters that it was. But once they superimposed the Super Mario World, Super Mario Brother characters on it and marketed it as Super Mario 2, it became a thing, and now it is canon. And so if you have a good thing,
Loosely. It was all a dream. So.
It's the windfish.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. Another storyline. But we digress. But that's kind of what I'm saying. So if the story is good and the story is there, then putting the other characters into that story in order to get the story into the public can be a good thing. But if you're just trying to be subversive or different for the purpose of being subversive or different, it doesn't matter what characters you're using, it's not going to work. So it goes back to the story needs to be important. So what about in like movies, abandoning canon? What have been some major screw ups there?
Batman v Superman?
There you go.
Yeah. See, and to point out, I'm of the opinion that Ben Affleck did a great
He
job
was
in the
fantastic.
role
I will
that
always
he did.
argue that.
I do think he would make a great Batman. I do not think that's the role he played. He played Punisher in a Batman costume.
Now, I will say this, and because you're already like trying to scramble to the comment section. Let me be clear about Batman and Ben Affleck playing Batman. You have to put him in the right timeline. So the Batman that Ben Affleck is playing, and I know we're going off topic, but this is what we do. Stay with us. We're doing great. The Batman Ben Affleck is playing has to come somewhere between Batman the Animated Series and Batman Beyond. He's closer to Old Man Bruce than he is to Bruce Wayne. And so that's, if you look at him in that context, it totally makes sense, especially when you have the scenes with in Justice League with Wonder Woman, when he's basically kind of sort of hinting that someone else needs to kind of take over as leader. But anyway, enough about that. So again, there we have trying to make a story that's not canon just for the sake of having the story, and it just failing completely and miserably.
Yes, and another thing about that movie, they tried to shove 3 movies into one, like 3 different stories into one movie that just didn't work. But yeah, this isn't about that movie, so let's move on.
Yeah, it took me so long to actually watch that movie. I watched the first 10 minutes, and I'm like, this is
just like,
ridiculous.
She was done after 10 minutes.
Can't.
But anyways, let's move on. Come on.
But okay, so that's pretty much all the questions I had about canon. I'm going to be honest with you. But so canon is important, but sticking to it 100% is not always best for the story. And so I think
it can be very detrimental to the story.
And I think that's really what it comes down to is you have the characters, you have these great characters, and if you are honoring the characters and you have a good story, then it really shouldn't matter whether it's canon or not. No, I don't want to say it really shouldn't matter. No, I'm gonna stick with that.
Yeah.
Canon is not as important as story and character, and sometimes getting away from canon actually comes back to make the story better.
Yes, and you mentioned certain cartoons or whatever that deviated from canon and were bad. There are some that completely got rid of any kind of canon that were awesome, like X-Men Evolution. It was very different than any of the canon comics or anything that's been done before, and it was actually really good because they focused on story and built up like that.
And sometimes it can even evolve, like the story itself can evolve. Like, you think about the 2011 Turtles run. It took all of the different canons and kind of melded them together into this beautiful whole and made sense of all of it. And so it took the elements that were good, it left out the elements that were bad, and made a new canon of the old, and it's a beautiful thing. So sometimes canon can evolve.
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess the point here that we want to say is canon is important, but it is also important to know that canon needs to be flexible, it needs to be allowed to evolve. And trying to win an argument by saying it's canon or it's not canon is really just immature and lack of sophistication. So don't do it. Well, I hope you enjoyed our little ramble here. And ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the multiverse.